Quiet now, everybody. Quiet, listen to me. We're going to start a show. Now, some of you people have been with me before. You know it's going to be a tough grind. You're going to dance until your feet fall off. You're not able to stand up any longer. But we're going to have a show.
Welcome to the Pink Door Podcast. Welcome to the debate. Today, we are diving deep into the February 2026 real estate market data for Kingston, Massachusetts, specifically looking at zip code 02364. We've pulled the latest MLS PIN data, the RPR property metrics, and the broader public records to really unpack the underlying mechanics of this specific local market. We are looking at a fascinating set of numbers, and it brings us to a central question that anyone watching real estate right now needs to understand. Does this February data indicate a hyper-competitive, accelerating seller's market that is constrained only by an extreme lack of inventory? Or, when we look under the hood, does the data reveal a market experiencing significant buyer friction, stalling momentum, and extended transaction timelines? I take the position that the extreme scarcity of inventory we are seeing right now, combined with those high sold-to-list price ratios, definitively proves this is a highly competitive seller's market where buyers are still, frankly, completely willing to pay a premium.
And I take the opposing view. I contend that the drastic increase in days on market we are observing, coupled with the downward trajectory of new pending list prices, indicates growing buyer resistance and profound market inefficiency, which is currently masking a broader slowdown in the Kingston area.
To set the stage from my perspective, we have to start with the absolute defining characteristic of Kingston real estate right now. It is profound, almost unprecedented scarcity. We talk a lot about the fundamental laws of supply and demand, but here they are dictating market behavior in a way that heavily, undeniably favors the seller. The primary metric we always look at is the month's supply of inventory. In February for Kingston, it is sitting at a critically low 0.73 months.
Which is incredibly tight. I will absolutely grant you that.
Right. Just to put that in perspective for anyone tracking this, a balanced market where neither the buyer nor the seller has a distinct advantage is typically considered to be around 5 to 6 months of supply. We are at less than 3 weeks. If not a single new house was listed in Kingston tomorrow, every piece of available inventory would be completely sold out before the end of the month. That's not just a shortage, that's a real estate drought. And that 0.73 figure represents an 11% drop just from last month and a staggering 42.5% drop year over year. The inventory is literally evaporating. Because supply is practically non-existent, the buyers who are out there are fiercely competing for what little actually hits the market.
But are they competing or are they just trapped?
I'd argue the data shows they are actively competing. Look at the sold-to-list price ratio. It stands at an impressive 101.6%, which is up almost 5.5% from January. Buyers are not just paying the asking price, they are bidding over it. When you combine that with a massive, nearly 27% month-over-month surge in the median sold price, bringing it to $608,000 on the MLS, the conclusion feels inescapable to me. When supply is effectively zero and buyers are actively opening their wallets to pay premiums over the asking price, the market is undeniably hot.
I hear those headline numbers, and I completely understand why you see a hot market. But I approach this data with a high degree of skepticism regarding the actual velocity of these transactions. We really need to look closer at the friction happening on the ground. I won't argue with the 0.73 months of supply. This scarcity is real. But I argue that despite this scarcity, the market is actually incredibly sluggish. Buyers are actively pushing back against these inflated valuations. If we pull up the RPR data, the Realtor's Property Resource Metrics, which give us a great under-the-hood look at what's really happening, the median days on market spiked to 95 days in February.
It's a jump, certainly.
It's not just a jump, it's a nearly 180% increase month over month. Think about what that actually means for a human being trying to sell their house. Half of the properties in Kingston are sitting for more than a quarter of a year before reaching a resolution. That is a massive amount of time for a home to be in limbo. Furthermore, there is a glaring discrepancy in the price reporting that we cannot ignore. While the open market MLS sold listings show that median of $608,000 you mentioned, the sold public records, which is a much broader and often more revealing metric, show a median of only $550,000. That public record median represents a 15.4% drop month over month. A true accelerating seller's market simply does not feature properties sitting for a median of 95 days, nor does it feature double-digit drops in broader public record valuations. What this suggests to me is a giant staring contest. Sellers are stubbornly holding on to high prices, and buyers are simply waiting them out, resulting in a stagnant, highly inefficient ecosystem.
That staring contest analogy is great, but let's look at who is actually winning it. Let's dig right into that first major point of contention, interpreting the time on market versus the ultimate sales price. I understand why you are focusing on the clock ticking. 95 days feels like a long time. But we need to look at the outcomes at the closing table.
Well, let's look at them. If you pull the specific single-family sold listings for February, the evidence of buyer hesitation is overwhelming. Take the property on Charles Drive. It took 134 days on the market to sell. Then look at Three Rivers Drive. That one took 69 days. If you aggregate the 6 total sold properties in the February data, the average days on market sits at an alarming 175 days. An average of 175 days to sell a home is not the hallmark of a seller's market. In a truly competitive, hot market, buyers act with urgency. They see a house, they make an offer that weekend. The total absence of urgency here indicates that buyers are unwilling to accept the terms being dictated by sellers up front. They are balking at the prices, they are sensitive to the interest rates, or they are picking apart the condition of the properties. That creates immense friction, and it is grinding transaction velocity to an absolute halt.
I see the friction, but you are looking at the timeline and completely ignoring the final transaction data. Let's revisit Charles Drive. Yes, it took 134 days to sell. Think about what that means practically. That seller sat through Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Valentine's Day. They had to keep their house spotless for showings for 4.5 months while paying their mortgage. But look at what it finally sold for. $899,000. Do you know what the initial list price was? Exactly $899,000.
So they found one buyer eventually.
They found a buyer who met their exact terms. The seller did not concede a single dollar after sitting on the market for over 4 months. That takes nerves of steel. But they were rewarded. And what about Three Rivers Drive? It took 69 days, but it sold for $800,000. The asking price was $799,000. It sold for $1,000 over the asking price after sitting for over 2 months. This is why I just don't buy the narrative that the market is stalling out. In a cooling market, a seller who sits for 100 days is forced to capitulate. They have to slash their prices just to attract a buyer. Capitulation is the absolute defining characteristic of a buyer's market. But in Kingston, sellers are getting exactly what they ask for or more. This proves that demand remains remarkably resilient.
Buyers might be taking their time to secure financing, getting their ducks in a row, or just taking longer to make a major life decision. But their ultimate willingness to meet these high valuations without demanding price cuts demonstrates that sellers retain total pricing leverage.
That is a fascinating way to spin a 134-day transaction. I'll give you that. But I come at it from a completely different angle. You are relying entirely on lagging indicators. Those properties on Charles Drive and Three Rivers Drive, they were priced months ago, entered the market in a different season, and finally managed to limp across the finish line in February. To understand where the market is actually heading right now, today, we have to shift our focus to the forward-looking metrics. We need to look at the leading indicators.
You're talking about the active and pending list prices.
Exactly. Because if sellers have so much unshakable pricing power, why are we seeing such a dramatic reduction in new list prices? The median list price for active listings dropped 7.6% to $739,499. But much more concerningly, look at the median list price for new pending listings. That number plummeted 11.2% down to $559,500, a
a drop of over 11% in a single month for the very properties that are successfully going under contract is a massive flashing red signal. It tells us that agents are having very tough conversations with their sellers. They're actively lowering their expectations to capture demand. They recognize that the buyer pool at those elevated price points has simply evaporated, so they are pricing new inventory much more conservatively just to get a deal done before the market softens further.
I think you're overstating the macroeconomic implications there. I actually defend the current market strength precisely by looking at the active inventory snapshot you just referenced. First, look at the velocity of the currently active properties. There are only 3 active listings in that specific snapshot, and they have an average of only 14 days on the market. That active immediate inventory, if it is priced well and presents well, is turning over very quickly. 14 days is basically 2 weekends of open houses and it's gone.
But they are turning over at much lower price points.
Well, let's address that drop to $559,500 for new pending listings. We have to look at the composition of the inventory, not just assume a market-wide price crash. In statistics, we call this compositional variance. When you have a sample size this incredibly small, literally single-digit transactions in a single zip code for 1 month, the median is highly sensitive to the specific tier of homes that happen to be transacting. A drop in the pending list price does not necessarily mean sellers are capitulating and slashing values across the board. It is far more likely a reflection of the fact that smaller, maybe less updated, Cape-style or ranch homes happen to enter the market and go under contract in February, rather than the big 4-bedroom colonials we saw close from previous months. You are extrapolating a massive market shift from what is likely just a localized change in what type of house was up for sale that month.
Compositional variance is certainly a factor. I'm not going to pretend small data sets aren't noisy. But that argument completely falls apart when you zoom out and look at the broader, comprehensive public records. And I think this is where we really need to focus our attention, the glaring discrepancy between the MLS data and the public records data.
They definitely tell 2 different stories.
Radically different stories. The open market MLS claims a median sold price of $608,000, which you cited earlier as evidence of a 27% surge. But public records, which capture absolutely all real estate transactions, including those non-MLS sales, show a median of only $550,000. And unlike the MLS data, that broader public record median is down 15.4% from the prior month. I argue that the broader market in Kingston is actually depreciating. The MLS data you are relying on is artificially inflated by a few high-end retail sales, like that anomaly on Charles Drive. When the comprehensive holistic data shows a 15+% drop in median value, we cannot just brush it aside as compositional variance. The overall liquidity and value of real estate in this zip code is pricing downward.
I certainly acknowledge the discrepancy, but we have to understand the qualitative difference between those 2 data sets. They aren't measuring the exact same type of economic activity. The MLS data represents open market retail demand. It is the truest, purest test of what a willing, unassociated buyer and a willing seller agree a property is worth when it is exposed to the general public.
But public records show what properties are actually changing hands for, regardless of the marketing platform.
Yes, but think about the messy human side of real estate that public records capture. Off-market transactions frequently include non-arm's length deals. This means family transfers, a parent selling their house to their kid for $200,000 below market value to keep it in the family. It includes estate settlements or distressed sales conducted outside traditional brokerage channels between private parties. Those off-market sales artificially drag down the median in the public records because they aren't driven by market value. They're driven by personal circumstances. To validate the actual strength of the market, look at the RPR median estimated property value. It sits at $732,810. That valuation model, which looks at the structural value of the homes, shows consistent growth. It's up 0.5% month over month and up 4.4% year over year. The fundamental equity in these properties is growing.
That makes the MLS data a much more accurate reflection of true open market retail demand.
I appreciate the distinction between arm's length and non-arm's length transactions, and it's a fair point. But have you considered what happens when we look at the lower end of that purely retail open MLS market? Even within your preferred data set, there are massive cracks showing. You mentioned the Charles Drive sale at $899,000 holding its value. But let's talk about the property on Broniker Avenue.
The one that listed for $375,000?
Exactly. It listed for $375,000. It sat on the open market for 32 days, and it ultimately sold for $305,000. That is a $70,000 haircut on a sub-$400,000 home. That is nearly a 20% loss from the asking price in just a month. What this tells me is that Kingston is currently a highly fragmented market. Yes, a buyer with an $800,000 budget who is likely rolling over massive equity from a previous home sale might still be willing to overpay after 60 days. But the entry-level buyer, the buyer reliance on standard financing, getting squeezed by high interest rates and daily living costs, has hit an absolute brick wall. The affordability ceiling is real. The lower end of the market is behaving very differently than the upper tier, and that fragmentation is a classic sign of underlying systemic weakness.
On that specific point, I actually agree with you completely. The market is undoubtedly fragmented right now. The behavior we are seeing at the $800,000 plus luxury or move-up tier is almost entirely detached from the reality of the entry-level tier. A $70,000 price reduction at the Broniker Avenue price point indicates a profound sensitivity to mortgage rates and down payment constraints. That entry-level buyer is looking at their monthly payment and realizing they literally cannot borrow the money to meet the seller's fantasy price. The luxury buyer simply isn't facing that same friction.
And that's the crux of my argument. Because when the entry-level market begins to fracture and stall like that, it eventually works its way up the entire property chain. The move-up buyers can't sell their entry-level homes to the first-time buyers, which eventually constricts the upper tiers as well. It's a domino effect. That is why I fundamentally believe the massive jump to 175 average days on market for sold properties and the actively falling pending list prices reveal a market where affordability ceilings have been breached. It is a highly inefficient market right now where the extremely low supply is literally the only thing preventing a much more obvious, painful price correction.
It's a compelling narrative, but let me give you a different perspective to summarize my stance. The scarcity we are seeing is not just a footnote, and it's not just a dam holding back a flood. It is the defining macroeconomic reality of zip code 02364 right now. When you have less than 3 weeks of inventory, 0.73 months, and buyers who are still, in the aggregate, fundamentally willing to pay 101.6% of the list price, the laws of supply and demand dictate that this remains a remarkably strong seller's market. Yes, buyers are taking their time. They are being careful. Days on market have absolutely extended. But the ultimate transaction values evidenced by properties selling at or above their asking prices after months of exposure prove that sellers still hold the ultimate leverage at the closing table.
And to bring my position home, I maintain that you simply cannot have a healthy or strong seller's market with the degree of friction we are witnessing on the ground. A 180% jump in median days on market, average sold time stretching out to nearly half a year, and leading indicators showing an 11.2% drop in pending list prices all point to a market suffering from buyer exhaustion. Sellers might eventually be getting their number in some isolated higher-end cases, but the market's inability to clear inventory efficiently suggests a stalling momentum that we ignore at our own peril.
Ultimately, I think what we have really illuminated today is that analyzing a local real estate market requires looking far beyond the headline numbers. There is a fascinating tension right now between historic, drought-level lows in inventory and these highly extended days on market. It really is a standoff. Sellers hold the cards because they possess the asset in a time of extreme scarcity, but buyers are no longer willing to rush their hands or capitulate instantly. The nuances in the Kingston data show a complex transitioning landscape.
I couldn't agree more. The February 2026 data from Kingston provides a perfect real-world case study in market inefficiency and friction. There are absolutely multiple valid ways to interpret the data we're seeing, and it proves that localized real estate is rarely a simple binary story of just prices going up or prices going down.
If you have any questions about this episode, or if you are thinking about buying or selling a house anywhere on Boston's South Shore, from Southie to Sagamore, give Jim Aldred a call. He would love to speak with you. Jim believes that people in transition often feel anxious about buying or selling a home, and he provides them with the guidance and security to help your family move on smoothly. Thanks for listening, and catch you on the next episode of the Pink Door Podcast.
Thank you.